Materials provided by Clay House Art.
The best case scenario for modeling a figure is if you can do it from life. So you have an actual model who's posing right in front of you. If you want to make a 3D sculpture, you better work from a 3D reference. The problem is so few people have access to working with a live model. And so for the purposes of this demo, I'm actually going to show how to shoot photographs because I think that's a much more valuable option for your average person who wants to learn figure modeling.
Definitely.
The thing about shooting a reference photograph for sculpture is you really need a very specific type of lighting. If I were to shoot a reference photograph for a painting, that's a totally different photograph than a reference photograph for sculpture. For example, whenever I've done portraits and I've lit a model, what I'm really looking for is very dark, dramatic shadows. I want bright highlights, and that's great for painting. But a photograph like that would be terrible for sculpture because the cast shadows have very sharp edges, everything's enrobed in shadow, and you really can't see the form very well.
Specific lighting. Could I just use my desk lamp maybe to light a model?
Well, that wouldn't work either because a desk lamp is like too concentrated. So actually the best lighting situation for sculpture is natural light coming through a window that's diffused. So you don't want direct sunlight because that's too dramatic, but like on a nice cloudy day, when you have that diffused soft lighting, it highlights the form beautifully.
Do I need to get every single angle?
I start out by photographing the entire figure. And I think what's tricky about it is if you stand too high or too low, you get a lot of distortion so that you could end up with a photograph where the figure's legs look way too short or they look way too long. So you have to make sure that you're looking at the model from eye level so you don't get that distortion. But so I have the model just rotate around really slowly so I get one view all around, that's the full figure. Then what I do is I start focusing on the very specific parts of the model. So for example, I'll shoot pictures of only the feet or only the kneecaps or only the hands and then only the face. And that allows me to get in really close and see the skin fold, see the musculature. I probably shoot 300.
Wow.
And most likely there's probably only going to be about 10 that I really actively use. But the thing is, if you're going to bother to get somebody to model for you, it's not difficult to shoot more.
Yeah.
And it's a pain to schedule a second session. I don't like to tell the model how to stand because I think it's very awkward for them. It's very unnatural because everybody's body moves differently. I had this teacher in graduate school who was so anal retentive about how he would pose a model. He'd be like, okay, move your front toe to the left. Now move your elbow 2 inches backwards. And it just seemed really artificial and annoying.
Like a little much.
It was a little bit too much. I'll say to the model, okay, just make sure we can see your torso and then just do whatever pose you want. Because sometimes I'll get an idea for a pose just by looking at the model that I couldn't have come up with on my own.
So if I was to go about sculpting someone, would I just start adding legs and arms and just with the clay?
You can't do that because if you're especially doing a standing figure, the clay's so soft and mushy, it's just going to collapse. You have to create a wire armature. When you have a wire armature holding up your sculpture, you can do almost anything. The wire is so stiff and so strong that you can pose it any way you want. To start with an armature, you need to first figure out how tall you want your figure to be. How tall your figure is also has to do with how thick the armature wire is. This is a 1/16 of an inch thin wire armature, and this is flimsy. I have a little figure like this, and it's very short. It's only a few inches tall. So a figure this size, you're okay using a 1/16 of an inch wide armature wire. This armature wire is 1/8 of an inch thick, so you can see it's a lot thicker. This might be okay on a figure that's about 10 inches high, but for me, it's a little bit on the flimsy side. So I'm actually going to use this armature wire, which again might be overkill, but with sculpture, you don't really want to mess with that. And I would rather have something that's too strong than something that's flimsy that would fall apart. I'm going to make my figure 10 inches tall. You want to double the length. So if the figure is 10 inches tall, you're going to measure 20 inches, okay? Now the thing is, you want to measure more than that because the thing about the armature wire is that if it's too long, it's not a problem because you can just trim it. But if it's too short, you're in trouble because it's a big pain to add a piece of wire onto another piece of wire. You could, but it's a hassle. This is 20 inches is right here. So I'm going to add, let's make it 30 inches. Cut that. And now you have your armature wire. You're going to fold the wire in half like this. This becomes the head, this loop over here. You don't want the loop to be too big because the armature has to be smaller than the figure. Like if your armature is too big, it's going to stick out through the clay, which is bad. So you don't want it too large. So I'm going to wrap this so it's a little bit tighter. Now you're going to take a pair of pliers. You're going to twist around like this. You have to do it really tightly. If you do it loosely, it's going to start moving, which is bad. You have a loop and you have two twists, and this part essentially becomes the neck.
It seems like you should really take your time with this part because it's an important part of the sculpture. And if this isn't working, then the rest of your sculpture isn't going to really work either.
Yes, you have to do a good job on the armature. Nothing is worse than having a sculpture that starts falling apart that has clay all over it. This is going to be the torso. So we're going to flip this like that. I want it to be a little wider than that.
How do you know how long or big to make each part?
If you have a figure that's 10 inches tall, you don't want the torso to be gigantic. And so I just eyeball it, honestly. If I did that, that's obviously looks gigantic. If you think about how big the head is, I'm going to twist again. Just the exact same way that I twisted the neck. Do you see how the legs are crazy long? The reason you want to do that is you have to leave space for the feet to be long enough that they can attach to the plywood base. You don't have to have your armature be really accurate proportions. Like if you want to do a figure that's got super long legs or like a really tall torso, you just adjust the armature to have that set of proportions. So an armature can be whatever you want it to be. It just depends on what you're looking for. I like to just bend the knees. Not so much because this is the pose, but just so I know where the knees are. For the arms, I just form something that's sort of like this. And then this goes as arms. Just trim a tiny bit down here. You should have this separate arm piece, 1/16 of an inch wide armature wire, and again, cutting it way too long on purpose. Take the armature wire and you stick it through the rib cage like this. You're going to wrap from the inside. It's going to feel like really wobbly and you're going to be like, oh my God, it's never going to work. But if you twist and turn and wrap it really tight, eventually it'll stay in place. Sometimes I do is I'll take a pair of pliers and bend it into place because sometimes you just can't do it with your hands. Your hands are just not going to be strong enough. If you touch it, see how strong that is?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
We need to pose the armature as best as we can into the model's pose. If you look at multiple photos and check it from every point of view, you can get it as close as you can. I'm not trying to replicate a 3D version of the model. I don't care if there's a little bit of distortion, if the legs are a little too long. You can see in the pose, he's a little bit hunched over. This leg is coming forward and the knee is bent. This is the part which is actually going to attach to the plywood.
When I'm looking at it, it actually looks like his knees are closer together than you put them. Why are you leaving space?
I shouldn't. I should actually fix that.
Well, I was wondering if it was because there's like you're going to add more bulk with the clay.
I will, but you do want to get it as close as possible. So you're totally right about that.
What would you do if you really bent the wire in a position that you didn't want and then you couldn't unbend it?
There is an option of taking it off and putting it back on again. You could do that. You could just take the pliers, pull it off.
Will it be a problem that there's this kink in the arm? Can you unbend that?
I would do as much as I could with the pliers, just by adjusting and tweaking. But you can also take a hammer and you can just flatten it. This foot is ridiculously long. What I'm going to do is just tap this, make it nice and flat. I don't think I need all of this, so I'm going to trim off like an inch or so, like that. I actually take nails and then I hit the nails so that they fold over the armature wire. I'll just draw a line so I know about where the foot is going to be, and I'll do it on both feet. I'm just going to put a little mark where I'm going to hammer in the first nail. Put the nail right here. You want to hammer it in pretty far because you actually don't need much of the nail and you need a pretty short nail. You hit the nail from the side so that it bends over the armature wire. See how I can't really hit here? You may have to bend your piece back in order to do that. So now I actually can do it. See how it's moving around a little bit? That's okay because I'm going to put another nail in now. The first one is the hardest. So do you see how the nail is starting to fold over? When you're hammering the nails in, it's better to do it on the floor. You can see that the figure got pushed backwards a little bit. So I find that after I finish the nailing part, I do have to spend a little bit of time adjusting and retweaking the position. This is definitely wonky. Let's fix that.
His shoulder's like popping out of place.
That is a little bit of a dislocated shoulder. One of the problems with figure modeling is finding a material that's permanent. If you use ceramic clay, it's a problem because then you have to have access to a kiln. You could also model it in, say, plastiline, and then you could cast it. You'd have to know how to cast, which is really complicated and difficult.
I've used a lot of Model Magic. It doesn't sit very nicely, so you can't get anything to really stand up. When you showed me this, it looked exactly like you had just finished sculpting it.
Yeah,
But
there's a
it's hard.
freshness to it.
And it feels actually like clay. There's also no cracks on it.
No, that's what I was amazed by because I think air dry clay is known for the terrible cracks that it makes all over the place. I really like this clay because it's a beautiful color. It's really good to have a lazy Susan because then you can put it underneath your sculpture like this, and then you can easily turn it around whenever you want. I really try to turn the sculpture a lot. I don't just sit and work on one side for a while because if you do that, you start to find that your sculpture looks like it has a side. One of the reasons I start with the torso is because the torso is the largest form on the human figure. You want to build the bulk of the biggest forms first and then move outwards. To me, this feels like ceramic clay. Like, feel how soft it is.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The arms I'm going to pull out a little bit because I find it difficult to work the torso if that's going on. You really have to pinch because if you put on the clay too loosely, it'll want to fall off. Sometimes I like to leave the neck somewhat undone so I don't forget where it is.
Now it looks kind of funky. And I guess you just have to be very patient when you're doing this.
You do. My priority right now is just getting the clay on the armature. It doesn't make any sense to try to actually model anything because you need to just cover the armature. I'm not actually even looking at the photos of the model.
Yeah, I noticed you're not doing any details. And
No.
I know a lot of people often want to go straight for the details, but it seems like that will not work here.
You can't do that with sculpture. It's really not an option because if the clay's not there, what are you going to sculpt? At this stage, I'm not trying to make a face. I'm just figuring out the orientation of the head. Do you see this arm, how it's too long? Normally, you could just trim it, but because he's actually touching the side of his thigh, I'm just going to stick this into the clay.
Will this clay stick to itself?
It does, yeah.
What age group would this work for in a classroom?
High school, I think probably 10th to 12th grade.
Okay.
Because the armature is a little bit on the tricky side.
We have Mushman.
Yes.
What next? Like, this is not the final product, right?
Oh, no, I hope not. I think the most important part to add is the centerline on the front and on the back of the figure. So on the back of the figure, you're going to draw a line that comes down the spine. I mean, the center line in the back is very easy to see because it's just the spine. Now on the front, it starts here at the pit of the neck. That's where I would begin the center line, and it goes basically right down the middle. Because the model is twisted a little bit, you can see his center line is also twisted a little bit. What I'll also start doing is making planes of clay. So instead of having just blobs of clay, I'm going to actually start doing stuff like this. This is one plane. If you look on the front, this is one plane. This is where I stop using my fingers so much because my fingers start to become a little bit klutzy.
Are there any preliminary projects you could do before jumping into a sculpture that might help students to be able to break down the planes of the body?
I think if you did a gesture drawing unit, That would be really good to do so that they have a sense of proportions. I'm going to try this knife instead. This knife is better.
Yeah, I was wondering. I was like, the wood one doesn't seem to be working for you.
Well, what I'm noticing about the wood one is it's taking off too much. And so this knife is actually working a little bit better in terms of getting the plane.
Do I need to know any anatomy when I sculpt the human form?
I think anatomy is helpful, but I think the more important thing is how the biggest shapes on the figure relate to each other. You have the hip, you have the rib cage, and you have the head. Those are the three biggest shapes on the figure. A lot of people think that the head and the neck and the torso are just stacked on top of each other like a bunch of blocks. It's just one shape on top of another. But it's not actually like that. If you look at the head sits pretty straight, but the neck actually lunges forward. The neck is not like a tube. It actually goes forward. And then the rib cage starts back here and then it lunges forward towards the bottom. So actually the rib cage is really bent. And then the hips actually go the opposite way of the rib cage. So if you go head, neck, rib cage, hip, it's actually twisty. It's not stacked. And I think that is so important because that affects every single part of the entire body.
Do I need to know all the tiny little muscles and bones of the body?
No, you don't. You just need to know where the bony landmarks are. A bony landmark is basically a part on the figure where the bone is right underneath the skin. Your elbow is a bony landmark because if you touch your elbow, you can feel the bone. It's right underneath the skin. But if I put my hand like this is not a bony landmark because I'm just touching muscle. No matter what type of body you're looking at, everybody has bony landmarks. So they're consistent. You can always find them on a figure. The ankle bones are a bony landmark. Your shoulder blades are bony landmarks. Your collar bones, your wrist, those are all bony landmarks. You're looking for those joints. The kneecaps are really important bony landmarks. If you can really locate those landmarks and work them into the rest of the forms, that's for a lot of people enough. Sure, there's a couple of muscles that I think are important to know about. The two pectoralis major muscles are very large because they go across the chest. These two muscles right here, which are called the deltoid muscle, those are very large and very prominent. I think it's good to know where the shin bone is because the shin bone is bony, but then you have a muscle back here on the calf, which is called the gastrocnemius, and that one usually is very prominent too. There are muscles like that that will help you, but the thing is musculature is so specific to the person you're looking at. Some people have really pronounced muscles, some people you can't see them at all. I think the more important thing when you're modeling is to just observe really carefully the forms. Look at how they relate to each other. Look at where one form goes on top of another form. That is actually much more critical than some of the really picky anatomical stuff because some of that anatomy, it just gets in the way. Because I know a lot of people, they know a lot about anatomy and they have experience drawing, but they don't know how to get from one place to another. It's like, what's the point of having that anatomical knowledge if you can't apply it into the context of painting or sculpture? That's why I like to keep anatomy really simple for students because it's too much. When you're modeling a figure, you can work additively, which is basically where you just add clay to the surface with your hands, or you can work with tools. What I have found is that in the very beginning of a sculpture, I'm using my hands a lot because it's big shapes. I'm trying to clunk on the clay and everything. But once you start getting into the more detailed areas, you're going to find that you have to switch to tools because the tools can get into tiny little nooks and crannies. Your fingers are too big for that. And also, I think the tools are able to give the sculpture a better sense of structure. The tools are so good because you can get very specific about the planes.
How do you know what tools to get or even what to use them for?
I think the tools that you choose, it's a very personal decision. It's sort of like makeup. Everybody has the foundation or the mascara that they happen to like. And really the only way to figure it out is to just try out a bunch of tools. I bought this tool a long time ago and it was not cheap. It was a very specialized tool and I found it useless. Actually, one of my favorite tools is a metal butter knife, which is so simple, but it's so good for applying plaster in a mold. Just because a tool is expensive or fancy doesn't mean it's good. And my feeling is that as long as it works for you, that's fine. This is one of my favorite tools because it's a little bit sharp, but it's also rounded, so I can really get in and carve things out. Whatever you think is going to make the process best for you is the way to do it. I know somebody who makes his own tools. Like, he'll just get a piece of wood and just shave it down and he'll just use it. Even though this clay does stay wet for a pretty long period of time, it definitely does start to dry on you as you're sculpting. For example, I think I had been working on this piece for at least a good hour or so, and I started to notice that a lot of the surfaces were starting to harden. The good thing about this clay, though, is that you could have an area of your sculpture that has already started to harden, and if you take some fresh clay and you put that clay on top of the dried clay, it will adhere to itself. I think the way to really use this clay is to try to work additively for the most part. Prioritize carving out any areas very quickly after you put the fresh clay on, so that you're not trying to carve an area that, say, has been sitting there for a good 2 hours. Really, the clay that works best for modeling really, really tiny details is probably plastiline, because plastiline is pretty stiff, and so it really has a density to it that makes it easy to go in and do little details. This air dry clay, it's a little bit trickier to do details. And really what you have to have is a pretty sharp metal knife. I found that the wood tools were a little bit too blunt for this. And that was the only way I could really get into some of the tiny areas. Even then, though, it's a little challenging. You do have to really guide the clay around. There are certain areas where in plastiline it would be a lot easier to do. But for me, it's a trade-off. I mean, not every single clay that you work with is going to be perfect and have every single aspect covered.
Say we want to get up and go have some dinner.
Mhm.
Can I just wrap it in saran wrap? Will it be okay?
No, you don't want to do saran wrap because that's not airtight. What you need is a plastic bag like this, and you just take the plastic bag, you cover the sculpture like this. I just pick it up and I put the bottom of the bag like this, all the way around 4 sides, take it off the Lazy Susan, put it down like this, and now it's airtight. You got to make sure that it's a pretty strong bag, that there's no holes in it, and that this really is sealed all around, and then it will be just fine.
Okay.
But this is very important because if you don't seal it well, you're in big trouble.
You don't need to add water to that, right? Because I've seen other people. Okay.
If you're using ceramic clay, yes, absolutely. But to my knowledge, this clay doesn't seem to need the water. I think it's just fine on its own. I feel like it would be a big mess if I put water on it, so I would just leave it like this.
How accurate are you trying to be with your sculpture? Are you trying to get it to be true to life?
Not really. I use the reference photos as a starting point. It's something that I can reference when I need some information. But what I've discovered is that the longer I spend sculpting the piece, the less and less I start looking at the reference photos. So in the beginning, when I'm sculpting, I'm really married to the reference photos in a way. I'm really looking at them, I'm referencing and really double checking a lot of the forms. But as the sculpture starts to evolve, I find the reference photos almost become a distraction because it's almost too much information and it prevents me from being more expressive with the clay or inventing the form a little bit more. So the further along I am, the less I use the reference photos until at the very end, I'm almost not looking at them at all.
How do you know when you're done working on a sculpture? Are you trying to get it to be smooth, or what surface are you going for?
I think that's up to every artist. Some people really like making it super smooth, hyper detailed. I don't tend to like that so much because one of the things I like about working in clay is that it is a form of gesture drawing, but 3D. And I love the rougher surface. I like seeing the hand in the clay. It's almost the equivalent of a painter who shows their brushstrokes. There are some people who may really like very smooth, very detailed surface. It's up to you, however you want to do it.
I was in a figure modeling class once where our teacher wanted us to be extremely exact. We had skulls that we compared sizes. Everything was measured.
Oh, wow.
It was very, very intense. It wasn't at all gestural. And this feels a little bit different to me. Like you're a little bit more free with the material.
I feel like I'm somebody who really responds to the physicality of the material. And for me, this clay is so soft and you can work and sculpt with it so quickly that for me, thinking about accuracy feels like a huge creative limitation. Not everybody feels that way. Obviously, some people, that's really important. But I think sculpture and the way you handle it's a very personal decision, how you decide. I went to a school where we had to measure everything. We would take calipers and we would put them on the model and then compare it to our sculpture. But to me, that's so cold and so sterile. Maybe this is just my personal aesthetic, but I like it when things are off. I like seeing the warts on people's faces. In the end, you just have to decide for yourself what your sensibility is.
Do I need to know?
Wait, I was doing something funny with my ear. Okay, let's start it again.
Okay. Oh, right.
Oh, right, me.
Okay, so I could just take a picture of my model on like Snapchat or Instagram or something.
Hang on, do it again.